Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the dim prospects of the Senate border bill, the return of SAT requirements at Dartmouth, and the death of country music superstar Toby Keith. We're joined by Sohrab, Ahmari, and Nina Power, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So it came out on Monday night. The Senate border bill, which has been worked on by a bipartisan group behind closed doors for weeks, has been made public. The pushback from conservative media was immediate and intense. And within the Republican caucus, there was such an intense degree of skepticism that even people who had played a role in crafting the bill are now backing away from it. We've published on this extensively. This week, we published Senator Josh Hawley's take on the bill, the border bill's assault on American workers at compactmag.com. Hawley argues that this bill, whatever its humanitarian pretenses, is bad for American workers. It hands out work visas to people even before their right to claim asylum has been established. It seems that arguments like Hawley's are prevailing.
Well, I don't know if it's accurate to suggest that it has humanitarian pretenses. The pretense is that this is like a shutting down of the border. I mean, it's framed as a response to the border crisis, which now everyone recognizes. It's become sort of a bipartisan fact, such that yesterday you had Al Sharpton, of all people, saying that there's an invasion of illegal immigrants in New York City, as he put it. This kind of language that you would never hear someone like Sharpton say on a network like MSNBC. So that tells you the degree to which the national mood has shifted on the issue and basically come around to the kind of border hawk restrictionist side. Republicans seemingly anointed a few of their own to do a kind of grand bargain negotiation with the Democrats, including most notably Senator Bill Lankford. You know, what they came up with is, I think, is a farcical bill, and everyone recognizes that on the right, including, like you said, Matthew, some of the people who initially backed the process. So, for example, as Mark Krikorian noted in a column for Compact, and this became a talking point in the days that followed, that piece was called, the headline was "Biden's Border Chutzpah." Look that up at compactmag.com. As he pointed out, for example, it gives the president emergency authority to shut down the border if the number of new arrivals any given day hits 5,000. If you just stay under that every day, theoretically, essentially the country is tolerating something like 1.8 million new arrivals. Second, as Krikorian pointed out, the president already has the president can exclude any new arrival. There's no need for some new emergency power handed down by Congress. The kind of existing legislation and just the whole constitutional structure give the president this kind of wide, broad power, discretionary power, and authority to exclude people. So why does that need a new bill that's pegged to a certain number? And then, of course, as Hawley pointed out in his piece for compactmag.com, that one, as Matthew already noted, the border bill's assault on American workers. The minute you are admitted in, which just happens, people sneak through, sometimes, kind of aided along by Border Patrol nowadays. The minute they come in, they can apply for and be almost immediately granted work permits. And it sort of assumes that asylum seekers are really refugees, properly speaking, when we know that they are not. The vast majority of these people are economic migrants. It doesn't mean the situations that they're escaping are not desperate. They are often desperate, but they're not refugees. They're not asylum seekers under the definition of U.S. law, of the Geneva Convention. They're not escaping necessarily immediate war zones and so on. But you give them work permits and they become like halfway part of the shadow economy in this kind of limbo status. Even if they're never actually granted asylum, you're not going to be able to remove them. Yeah, you combine all of that, and I think the kind of Republican rebellion was justified. I care about the inside baseball question of did Mitch McConnell, the minority leader currently, put up Lankford to do this and basically then hang him out to dry? But that's a more kind of political insidery question. I don't have any special insights on it, but curious about it.
Yeah, you raise an interesting question, Sohrab, about kind of the nature of this bill and its public presentation. And as you mentioned, it's been marketed as a restrictive measure, despite having a certain permissive character. The text of the bill does make clear that provision will be made for various kind of humanitarian type services being offered to migrants. So there's 2 million plus, appropriated for kind of wraparound services offered by NGOs that offer linguistically and culturally appropriate care and housing and support services to migrants, especially unaccompanied minors. So somewhat in the nature of compromise language, that it has this kind of chimerical quality where it's more like Janus with two faces. Is it sort of humanitarian? Is it harsh? That's one of the things that's really notable about this bill, that seeks to, it's been presented as a restrictive measure, but there's quite a lot in it that is aimed kind of explicitly so at easing. And that's just one characteristic of this bill, that it has that double character.
Yeah, I mean, one aspect of it that's being picked up in the foreign press, at least the way it's been presented in the UK, is, and this relates to something that we've been talking about on a regular basis, which is the US's attempt to do multiple things at once without being clear, which is to say it also includes these provisions for money to providing billions of pounds in support of Ukraine, for example, right, is also somehow in this bill, right? 60 billion to Ukraine, 14 billion to Israel, 2.4 billion to the US Central Command to deal with the Red Sea problem, more billions to support people in the Indo-Pacific, heading off the China possible problem. So this bill seems like a kind of weird amalgam of multiple things. It's not at all clear, like you say, whether it's there to be harsh, whether it's there to be compassionate, and then all of this other stuff about foreign aid, which is certainly how it's been depicted in the UK as this sort of not only a compromise, but I guess like a fudge and a kind of melange, I guess, almost.
Yeah, Matthew, can you, do you know why? I mean, I'm genuinely curious, like, when did it become a thing that Congress doesn't do discrete bills about the actual issue, that is under discussion or controversy, but rather, so we're going to do a border bill. Let's slip in like the Indochina military aid and the Ukraine issue, and when did Congress become, it was like, you can't just, is it because they just want to, because nobody can agree on any kind of compromise on any given issue in order to get to enough votes? You have to slip other things in as poison pills. Like, if you want Ukraine aid, you got to support my border bill, vice versa. Yeah, and I say this in part because Matthew, you used to work on Capitol Hill.
Yes, I was once employed by the House of Representatives as a U.S. page, and in that role, I ascended to the elevated station of documentarian, which meant that I got to leave school early. Our school started very early in the morning at about 6, and then I got to leave school after just about an hour, and I would go get the physical copies of the text of the bills from the printing office and bring them to the House floor, and then I would run the voting system to call the members to the floor, sitting by the rostrum. This, of course, does give me great expertise in Congress, its workings, and its history. I mean, in this case, we know that skeptics of Ukraine aid made a political issue of it and said, why are we aiding Ukraine when we can't secure our own border? And, then people, the Ukraine hawks said, okay, well, we'll try to bring along the border hawks. We'll create this bill. But of course, they didn't go as far as the border hawks wanted. And I think as far as the border hawks reasonably wanted, if they had adopted something like the House GOP's preferred border solution, it would be interesting to see if the Ukraine funding, the kind of combined Ukraine and border bill would have actually passed. I don't know that. I'll just say, because this is of great relevance, when I was a page, this was in 2002, 2003, I arrived in DC just about a year to the day after 9/11. So we were still very much in that moment. The DC snipers were going. And when I was there, the House passed the authorization for the use of military force in Iraq, and it was quite a time. That had very strong bipartisan backing. I think there's a lot of forgetting of how widely supported that war was at the time. In other news, Dartmouth has decided that standardized tests will once again be mandatory for applicants. This is kind of another step back toward normality. Dartmouth had already the prior year recommended taking standardized tests. And before that, standardized tests had been presented as completely optional, not even recommended. So Dartmouth is the first Ivy League institution to do this. It follows the course set by MIT, which has also brought back standardized test requirements. Nina, you're still an educator. You're no longer a formal academic. But someone whose life has been defined to such a great extent by academia, what's the role you see of standardized tests? Are they oppressive, as some have claimed, or do they have a real usefulness?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very complicated question, and it can't be really detached from the kind of other political forces and economic forces and the shifting nature of higher education as basically also a kind of debt generating machine. And the UK followed the US in this about 10, 15 years ago. So I mean, we in the UK, we have a kind of 11 plus equivalent. We no longer have the same system that was generated, which sent some people to comprehensive schools and some people to grammar schools or secondary moderns. And then the people with the higher results went to a separate school. But the reason why people did this in the 50s and 60s was obviously to uphold an idea of meritocracy, so that if you were poor but clever, why should you not attend a good school? And we also have the private school system. I mean, it's heavily class-based, the whole thing. But there was at least an attempt post-war as a kind of social mobility, the possibility of social mobility. And many people in my parents' generation, including my parents, benefited greatly from this opportunity to go to a grammar school, which was more academic. We don't have the SAT system for universities. We base it on A levels, and we base it on kind of predicted grades. This is also very complicated because if you go to a private school, you're allowed to take more A levels, and it's very, very unfair. And people at private schools get higher grades simply because the schools are sort of better at getting people through A levels. So we don't actually measure raw intelligence. Maybe that's not exactly what the SAT is measuring, but I understand it as an attempt to strip away as much of the kind of cultural and educational, I don't know, baggage is not the right word, but the kind of accoutrements that one could pay for or that one could get by attending a better school, right? So it's an attempt at a kind of meritocracy. Obviously, we have a lot of discussion around IQ at the moment, which isn't always helpful. We published Michael Lind on this question a while back. But I think there is a kind of a class question, really, and a question about what kind of country we want to see and who we want to give an opportunity to, right? It's very obvious that there are intelligent people who come from poorer backgrounds, who haven't had the best schooling. And it seems like there must be a way of measuring intellectual capacity or potential that doesn't discriminate against particular people on the basis of economic disadvantage. And it's certainly my experience, just to finish, that people who came through clearing, which is a system where people have basically failed their A levels, but they can still go to university if there are places available. And where I was teaching, we took in people through clearing, and their educational academic performance was no different from people who had higher grades. There was no noticeable difference basically between people who'd done badly in these official exams and people who hadn't. And, we have to think that there are other ways of understanding academic capacity. I also think there are too many people at university. I think the universities are basically being run as kind of scams and debt-making machines. This is another question we'd have to talk about, how to get the most intelligent people in, the vision of the country we'd like to see, the role that universities and colleges should be playing in the construction of citizenship and, scientific and intellectual achievement, which is not clear at the moment. And all of that stuff is being taken over by private individuals, and we're basically back to a system of patronage in many ways. But yeah, it's a very, very complicated question. I'm probably pro bringing back the SAT because I think it's fairer to poorer people of all classes and races, and I think people should not be discriminated against on the basis of class or race.
Yeah, I have to cheer this development if I'm just going to be honest to my own biography. I mean, without standardized testing, it's inconceivable that I'd be where I am today, given that I grew up in a rural community that didn't, as a rule, send people to kind of elite academic institutions. Neither of my parents has a college degree. Just in kind of personal terms, that's important. I mean, there are downsides to the meritocratic vision of American life. It's something that Sohrab has discussed in our pages in an essay titled "Down with Diversocracy and Meritocracy." That there are real limits to the meritocratic outlook, which is in various ways at war with other more kind of communal or solidaristic visions of American life. It's what made me, and it's I think better than the alternative, the kind of woke alternative that has emerged in its wake, as Sohrab argued in our pages.
The diversocracy that was being imposed with a special vehemence in the past few years would have just created much worse much harder time, first of all, for institutions to judge people on a mass scale. Like, how do you do that? Just all based on kind of these subjective factors of stories and narratives. Like, yeah, you gotta have some way of like sifting people, and so that's the most practical aspect of it. It would allow for all sorts of gaming and privilege, based on grievance hierarchies and grievance stories, and it would all be all the more kind of unaccountable and difficult to kind of scrutinize, precisely because there's not a kind of numerical factor that you can use. So for those practical reasons, what was being imposed on us was unworkable, and this is a recognition of that by an institution like Dartmouth, and I suspect that others will fall in line as well. And I hope that this also happens at the K through 12, the kind of elementary through high school level, where very kind of progressive city councils, etc., in places like Oregon or Massachusetts. I just said Oregon the way Al Pacino says it in Scent of a Woman. I don't know why I said it like that. Oregon. And Massachusetts, of doing away with testing, doing away with like anything kind of discernibly linked between linking performance and sort of grade outcomes or quantitative outcomes. Like, this is madness. And again, I just think it'll just empower people who are good at gaming the system far worse than the kind of whatever it is it was intended to replace. That said, listeners want to check out that piece. There are reasons to be uncomfortable with pure meritocracy, not least whether or not it's actually a reflection of kind of America's older kind of Jeffersonian ideal, which I think is venerable and worth trying to preserve under modern conditions. Some aspects of that.
This week it was announced that Toby Keith, the country music singer, died. It was made public last year that he had cancer. I guess this is another moment to recall that post 9/11 era, back when I was house page. I don't know, Sohrab, you were living in Utah at the time. Nina was, in Britain. Nina, how big was Toby Keith in the UK?
I'm gonna say not so big. I mean, there are lots of country music fans here too. Obviously, your culture is kind of, ours in many ways. But I'm just looking at the British reception. I think there was a very big piece about him in the Daily Mail, which is, hugely well read, but also internationally, also by Americans for some reason. They read the Daily Mail. And so there seems to be some kind of recognition of this. I mean, I sort of vaguely remember things to do with like the Dixie Chicks and I don't know, various things. But I think country music in America is maybe a little bit more hermetically sealed than other bits of your culture, right? Like he's not like a Taylor Swift figure for us or whatever. Obviously he's clearly very beloved, and I think most of the papers today are more covering in terms of health news the fact that King Charles has just been diagnosed with prostate cancer, so there's a lot of discussion of that. Huge front page notifications about Prince Charles being quite ill. So yeah, what can we say? Cancer is the devil.
The first Toby Keith song that I kind of heard and that struck me was "How Do You Like Me Now?" How do you like me now that I'm on my way? I don't want to play any recordings here because we would shut down Compact with just the punishing legal fees that would ensue. And then, of course, his most famous number, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, kind of post 9/11, belligerent anthem about striking back at America's enemies. And this occasioned a big controversy with the other absolutely gigantic country music act of that time, the Dixie Chicks. The Dixie Chicks, at a concert in London, had criticized George W. Bush over the Iraq War. They had also, Natalia Maines, member of the Dixie Chicks, had also called Toby Keith ignorant over his song Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. Keith responded by producing a doctored image showing Maines next to Saddam Hussein and displaying this large image at his concerts. Standing behind all this, I think, is early foreshadowing of controversies over American cancel culture. Keith complained that he felt the Dixie Chicks were trying to suppress his free speech by calling him ignorant. He wanted to say what he felt about America. He wanted to say what he felt about its enemies, even in the kind of raw language employed in that song. Meanwhile, of course, the Dixie Chicks face their own very intense backlash over their criticism of George W. Bush, something that really kind of shaped and harmed their reception among kind of country music listeners. I mean, the country music station in my hometown, main radio station, open every morning with playing the Star Spangled Banner, along with like reading the school lunches and the meals at nursing homes. Also has, like a daily devotional from the Town Ministerial Association, daily update from National Right to Life, the anti-abortion group. And that's the secular station. Then there's the Christian station in town. So, in that kind of very conservative culture of country music, the Dixie Chicks weren't looked on very fondly for their criticism of Bush. My own tendency looking back is to say that I got a lot of pleasure out of the music of both those people. So I'm just at this distant remove, I'm disinclined to pick a side between Keith and the Chicks, who I think are maybe now just called the Chicks. I think they dropped Dixie because it was considered a little too insensitive.
Oh, that's right. They would. Which one was right about the Iraq War? Which of the two camps? Everyone would agree that the Dixie Chicks have been vindicated because it was a disaster. I mean, it's become a bipartisan consensus that the Iraq War was a disaster. And the interesting thing is, I would venture to say that lots of Americans who at the time effectively canceled the Dixie Chicks and rallied to Toby Keith's more like, I think it's fair to say kind of jingoistic anthem, are now people who are skeptical of foreign policy hawkism. Probably Trump voters, a lot of them, I would guess. A lot of them are fed up with funding the Ukraine war, fed up with other interventions that have yielded nothing for the United States other than to waste blood and treasure. I think it's just an interesting turn of events to consider how they've switched positions like that. Not the two figures themselves, but their audiences and how the shifts that they've undergone. But the other thing that I remember is that the phenomenon we call cancellation is as old as human society, right? So I don't want to get into this, but like as a distinct mode of public cancellation for one's political views, the earliest that is etched in my political consciousness, which resembles what we now call cancellation, was actually the Dixie Chicks in 2004. It's funny, I was just watching a Chappelle segment from 2004 where he said, I almost protested the war, but then I watched what happened to those Dixie Chicks. And if that's what they did to three white women, imagine what they would do to me. And it was very cancel-like. It was a very cancel-like moment. And then you fast forward, then the internet version of that came in. I've written about this for another publication that shall not be named in 2013 with the cancellation of that marketing executive, Justine Sacco, I want to say is her name, who tweeted out right before her flight to Johannesburg took off, going to South Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. And then like when she had landed on the other side and finally regained wireless access or Wi-Fi, whatever, she was fired from her job, utterly ruined. And the funny thing is that like all the people who lined up to cancel her, it was a bipartisan spectrum. Donald Trump was one of the people who at the time said this woman is disgusting. I can't remember what exactly he said, but he said this is a disgusting comment and she should pay a price and so on. Anyway, we went from talking about Toby Keith, rest in peace, to cancellation and Justine Sacco, but that's because Matthew took us in that direction. That's how we are. We kind of cross-fertilize ideas and historical references.
Yeah, well, others may take less interest in kind of early 2000s country music than I do, but I'd say that Toby Keith reminds me more of my childhood because he was played more and embraced more fully than the Dixie Chicks. But the Dixie Chicks are a lot better. I mean, their music is just much, much better than Toby Keith's. He has some great songs, but don't really touch the best of the Chicks. With that, thanks Sohrab, thanks Nina, and thanks to you listeners. For more, compactmag.com/subscribe.